Hello ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to start off this video by thanking you in advance for your time. I really appreciate your attention and hope that this presentation finds you doing well. For this assignment on historical media industries, I chose to take a closer look at the film industry. To be more exact, I will be discussing with you the Motion Picture Production Code, otherwise known as the Hays Production Code, which regulated all the films to grace the silver screens in the US between 1930 and the end of the classical era of Hollywood. I feel that this production code is important to talk about and understand because it literally shaped one of the highest esteemed eras of film. However, there is and has always been a lot of pushback with this code of regulation from viewers, actors and actresses, writers, and even prominent directors of the golden era, such as Alfred Hitchcock and Otto Preminger. Nonetheless, the restrictions enforced by William H. Hays and the Production Code Administration in the mid-1930s gave way to our current rating systems for films, which means that the era of code drew some major implications that can still be felt and resonate to this very day. So, today I will be uncovering some of this information by exploring with you in depth the brief time before the code and why it came about. Then, I will unreel for you all the rules and regulations made by Mr. Hays and how it affected the Hollywood film industry during its enforcement, before finally revealing how it evolved to what we currently know as our film ratings system. Although the code wasn't enforced until 1934, I believe it is important to discuss some of the history leading up to it. The idea of regulating films can be traced back to 1907, when several cities and states sought to curb the moral influences of films through censorship laws. Chicago was the first to mandate provisions for the film content that was being showcased in theaters. These aims were held up by the State Regulation Board, and as you can imagine, the five major studios of the time, MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century, Paramount, and RKO, were not so happy. These state regulations interfered with the revenue the production companies were making. Sponsorship is another way that they were losing money. If one state decided that a particular film was not in compliance with its regulations, they would cease to show it or force that the parts that were out of line with their vision to be spliced out. This furthermore interferes with their production by forcing the studios to make separate copies for each set of mandates. To no one's surprise, the major companies, with all of their money, fought back in hopes of asserting their stories as free speech, which lands us in one of the many Supreme hearings concerning the Hollywood film industry. Mutual Film Corp versus Industrial Commission of Ohio. In 1915, the famous studios took a loss when the highest court in the United States of America denied the studios the rights of the First Amendment, particularly the freedom of speech, because movies were not to be regarded as part of the press of the county or as organs of public opinion. But this denial seems odd in a time where films still lacked the entanglement with audio. But what the states, churches, and ultimately the courts were looking to prohibit was the freedom of expression that these early narratives had. Like the historic entertainment of the Romans, these narratives could be ultra-violent or sexual. For now, let us fast forward to the year 1920, when there were multiple states with regulations backed by the National Board of Censorship and unhappy filming studios. During this election year, William Hays was serving as a cabinet member to the U.S. President-elect Warren G. Harding, and in 1921 was appointed Postmaster General. These two positions were crucial in his political career as they gave way to the birth of his Hollywood holidays. In 1922, the five major film studios conjoined their differences and took aims at a method to detach their films from the intervention of the state and the church. Thus was born the Motion Picture Production and Distribution Association, or the MPPDA. This cabinet was to serve as a regulatory alliance for films across the United States. With knowledge of Mr. Hays' resume as a spokesperson who had great connection with the current Republican Party in command, the studios decided to offer him the position. And with an annual salary of $150,000, you can bet he accepted it. The initial thought of this hire was that as a Catholic who was part of the Republican influence, Hays would be able to steer the studios clear of further intervention from Washington, D.C. However, this move was early criticized by Herbert Brennan, a film director of the time. Brennan claimed that the appointment of Mr. Hays would further commercialize an already too commercialized art. Although he was in prime position, it wasn't until 1927 that William H. and his team actually established a set of guidelines for the prominent medium called the Don'ts and Be Careful, which were based off the timely specifications from state and national sensory boards. But even though these rules were set, the studios were only held to voluntary participation, which rendered them useless for the most part, even though there was now a reviewing committee of scripts in Hollywood called the Studio Relations Committee. 3 years later, in 1930, the Hays Office would add another layer of written restrictions and introduce the not so notorious yet Hays Code. But, like the previous restrictions, they required voluntary compliance. These actions would not suffice the outrage of the church. After being led astray so long, the Catholic and Protestant Church were aching to take matters into their own hands, with the Catholic Legion of Decency being formed in response to the MPPDA's lack of repercussions. The heat was on. With its 11 million members, the Legion was able to finally hurt Hollywood where it hurt the most, the pocketbook. It wasn't until 1934 that the regulation of these films began to be enforced. William H. Hays and the MPPDA created the newly formed Production Code Association, or the PCA, which is authorized and maintained by the producing companies using it. At the head of the helm was Catholic conservative Joseph Breen. Under his provision, Joseph mandated all scripts to be revised by him in his office. And now that the code is actually being enforced in July of 1934, we can take a look at what the code constitutes as decent. There are 3 general principles of the production code and 12 particular applications. Let's start with number 1 of the general principles. Number 1. No picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standard of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Number 2. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Number 3. Law, natural and human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. Moving on with the particular applications, we can see that there is a hefty list of restrictions that now has to be obeyed. These restrictions forbade the studios from going too far with murder, methods of crime, illegal drug traffic, the use of liquor, sex, adultery and illicit sex, scenes of passion, seduction or rape, sex perversion, white slavery, miscegenation, sex hygiene, actual childbirth, children's sex organs, vulgarity, obscenity, profanity, costume, dance, religions, locations, national feelings, titles, and last but not least, repellent subjects. As you can see, under each one of these restrictions, we have a short list or a detailed explanation of what it is that these things actually mean. With all of these restrictions at play, it was impossible for any narratives that step outside of the Production Association standards to be shown in a theater. In fact, all films that were pre-approved by Joseph Breen received a number seal of approval from the Production Code Association. This seal was to be displayed before the film in the reel, and if one was shown and caught without it, it would call for an expensive fine and the dismissal of that film from theaters. Although it may seem like a huge obstacle for the studios, let us be reminded that it was the 5 major studios who created the association. So, it wasn't a complete kill for the studios. In fact, after the creation of the production code, we entered the notoriously known classical age of Hollywood. Although the 30s and 40s didn't produce 800 films a year like the 20s, there wasn't a total drop in revenue, as these newly created films could now entertain a greater audience. These films were also appropriate to export our American culture worldwide. Today, the world still recognizes films in the era such as Casablanca, Double Indemnity, and my favorite, Citizen Kane, as some of the best works that have come out of the US. But, with all of these restrictions imposed, it was difficult for these films not to become redundant or typical, even to the eyes of the viewers. Following the Second World War, we begin to see a seismic shift in the reception of American films from its viewers. With our soldiers and families now exposed to films from other countries, the American people became discontent with the monotone film styles that they had become accustomed to. So, in the early 1950s, film directors, some of which came from the war and overseas, began to experiment with the limitations of the Hays Production Code. After various film narratives complicated the restrictions imposed by the code, the topic of decency again was on the table. Fortunately for the film industry, in 1952, the Supreme Court ruled that films are to be protected under the First Amendment. This action did not immediately cancel the regulations set by Mr. Hayes and Mr. Breen, but the PCA certainly found it more difficult to suppress the films for indecency. Shortly after the ruling, the film The Moon is Blue, an erotic comedy, was showcased in U.S. theaters. In December 1955, The Man with the Golden Arm, starring Frank Sinatra as a heroin addict, was released and was a smash hit. The film was nominated for numerous awards, including Academy Awards and Otto Preminger. The director set a new standard for entertainment. While it's safe to say that this film put the nail in the coffin for the production code, the provisions set by Mr. Hayes were not overthrown until 1968. The film industry instead swapped these restrictions for the current rating systems we have today. Now, we decide what we watch, with the only restrictions being set for age and maturity.